हाँ कौन दे रहा है It's live.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in from all around the world. We are live from the Ambience Boutique Art Hotel in Gulberg, Lahore. This exquisite hotel was constructed in October 2020 and is featuring pieces from young and upcoming artists. This fresh take on art is exactly the debate we're going to have today. My name is Ali Jatta, and I'm moderating today's debate. On behalf of myself, Beaconhouse School System, and School of Tomorrow team, I welcome you to the 12th edition of School of Tomorrow events, A World of Tomorrow, From Darkness to Light. We have a very exciting debate for you lined up today. Before I introduce the participants, please allow me to introduce the topic as well. The topic for today is art is plagiarism or evolution. Let me now take an opportunity to introduce the exciting panel we have today. First up, we have Afan Noshahi. Afan is part of the debating circuit for the past 5 years. He has been judging tournaments and speaking all across Pakistan. He has been the runners-up at the Nationals 2018, winner of the Sondhi's Tournament 2019, and has been to Lums Ivy finals back-to-back in 2016 and 2017. He's also part of the Pakistan National Debates Camp in 2020. Currently, he's studying as a freshman at Lums and hopes to bag the acceptance from Duke University in December. With him, we have Mr. Sharjeel Ahmed. Sharjeel Ahmed has been part of the Debating Society of Pakistan for the last 6 years as a debater, and for the past 2 years, he's represented Pakistan at the World School Debating Championship held in Thailand 2019, and the online WSTC event held in 2020. He's currently a physics major at Lums and manages a company, Learners In, which aims to make the education accessible and effective for all students. Inside opposition, we have Mr. Danial Makpool. Mr. Danial Makpool has spoken at numerous finals at both local and international tournaments, including the All Pakistan Senior Debating Championship, the Lums Intravarsity, the Australian National University Spring Open, and the Shajivna International Debating Championship. He was also the best open speaker at Lums Ivy and the second best English as second language speaker at Durham Ivy. Currently, he's a sophomore at Lums and pursuing a computer science degree. With him speaking today is Mr. Balaj Khan. Mr. Balaj Khan is also studying at Lums. He is an active debater and has been part of the debating community for the past 6 years. He's also been a part of the Debating Society Pakistan camp and has represented Pakistan at various international tournaments. Thank you all for joining us today. Judging this very exciting debate, we have Ms. Aisha Mirza. Ms. Aisha Mirza is a renowned educator. She's also a writer and a feminist. She's a DSP alumni and has represented Pakistan in various capacities, including debate, education, peace summits, and economic conferences. Her main area of interests are gender, art, and education. Thank you very much, ma'am, for joining us today. Before we begin, we have a pre-debate poll for you guys. We'd like you to record the opinion about this debate, and we want you guys to send in your opinions. This debate, under the motion of is art plagiarism or revolution, will be live at live.sotevents.com. We'd like you to access that website, send in what you think about this debate before even we get into it. Your opinion is very, very valuable to us. We have reserved a certain amount of time for this, so if you log on now, you'll be able to access the poll. Before we get into the debate, I also want to brief all our listeners today and all our viewers that the debate format is a 2-on-2 format. 2 speakers from proposition, Mr. Afan and Mr. Sharjeel, will be taking the floor. 2 speakers from opposition, Mr. Balach and Mr. Danial, will be speaking and taking the floor. We also have all speakers will be making 6 minutes constructive speeches and will get 4 minutes to reply. In between, speakers also get an opportunity to ask the other team a question, share their views, and engage and take the debate further. Last but not the least, assisting me today on my right is our timekeeper, Mr. Mohammed Ibrahim from Beaconhouse Defense Campus. Before having all of the modalities out of the way, I would now like to call upon the first speaker from Team Proposition, Mr. Afan Noshahi. Here, here.
Art is great, plagiarism is great. In the context of art, fantastic.
Am I audible in the room?
Answer question what they mean about revolution.
Some of the great dilemmas that we face today, ladies and gentlemen, is that now we feel untouched by the problems of others. We are disjointed by the larger issues that we face today, such as climate change, such as the radicalization that we see in the West and the East, and just the meta of the problems that exist within the status quo. We don't feel strongly enough to be part of a larger community that strives for what is greater than your own selves. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, this is where art makes a true difference. Because art does not necessarily tell you what the instructions are. It does not tell you what to do. Rather, it engages people to connect on a deeper level. It makes people feel. And this feeling spurs thinking, engagement, and action. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, this feeling is exactly the true revolutionary nature of art. Before moving forth, let's understand what this debate is about, right? We think to do that, we need to understand the nature of art itself. Proposition here believes that art is a form of communication. It is a form of self-expression. It is a form where where it is a profound union of the body and mind. And here we do not limit art just to movies, just to TV shows or media, etc. We think art is even greater than that. We think it is embedded within the human nature as well. So we talk about art in theorems and science as well, because that is also a part of the human thinking, the creativity of it all. Because people sit and think about such things as well, and that also encompasses art in it of itself, because it is a catalyst to bringing about tangible, positive change. Let's also understand another important aspect of art, right? It is the subjectivity that it causes art to be different for every single individual. This is exactly why the same piece of art, let's say a tree, for example, is going to mean different things for two very different people. And this is why we separate ourselves from opposition here as well. We tell you that art cannot be plagiarism just because of the fact that it has that subjective nature attached to it. We think that if you call art plagiarism, you actively call into question the nature of human beings and their right to self-expression in the very first place. It can't be plagiarism because the intent of the artist is something that's very important as well, because you cannot measure the intent of these individuals, and this subjectivity at the end of the day is what is going to make art have its revolutionary tool in its essence. So let's talk about the revolutionary nature of art. We think art has the tendency to move people and bring about transformative change. We have seen instances of this in human history throughout, whether it be the revolutionary art by Catalan artists that became the symbol of their freedom against oppression, whether it be the art in the French Revolution where you captured the death of Jean-Paul Marat, which became a source of reigniting the French Revolution, which had lost its way, ladies and gentlemen. This shows you that art can rally millions of people behind it by giving them this sense of direction that is so very integral. But that's not to say that art is only important or revolutionary only in instances of war or only in instances of conflict. We think that the bigger revolution that art brings about is the way that it changes and shapes the way people think at the end of the day. And that nature and this revolution bridges divide between people. And this isn't just fluff, ladies and gentlemen. if you intuitively think about this, it all makes sense. And it all links back to the nature of art itself. Because in art, disagreement is a part of the artistic experience. In fact, disagreement adds value to art itself. We think that this criticism and disagreement is readily accepted within art, and this allows radically different groups of people to come together at a consensus. And even if they don't come to a consensus, they can believe and they can they can act in harmony and accept the other people's opinion. We have seen instances of this in the tangible world, as real world as well, such as the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, that's making studios on the island of Lesbos, who's drawing attention to the plight of millions of migrants within Europe as well. This shows you, ladies and gentlemen, that art goes beyond the us versus them mentality. It goes beyond that mentality, and it readily accepts people from other cultures, and it accepts people from other walks of life at the end of the day as well. So this is what proposition believes to be the true nature of art as well. At the end of the day, we think it is more than just bloody conflicts where it brings about revolution. It is even more than the way that you think at the end of the day, because it is so embedded within human nature. Art throughout history has had the ability to put previous works in new contexts and has encouraged new artistic and even political movements throughout the world. From Cubism to New Dadaism, it continues to revolutionize the world even today. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Mr. Irfan. I agree with you. Art is immeasurable and transcendent. I think the space we are in today echoes exactly the same. Let's now hear from Team Opposition's first speaker, Mr. Danyal.
Hello, quick mic check. Am I audible? All right, that's great. Okay, starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1. I think side proposition conflates something very important, i.e. the creation and consumption of art. Because notice, everything they tell me about the revolutionary metric they wish to defend is how people perceive art. We agree, sure, people will probably perceive art in different ways. That's fine. But what we take issue with is the point of creation, the artists who make the art, the process by which different artists convene, discuss what is highbrow art, or discuss what mainstream art is, and then create something out of it. We think at that point, this process of creation and discussion between artists, that is fundamentally a plagiaristic thing, i.e. it's built upon the creation of artists before them, or built upon creations of different contemporary artists. But we also don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. We're okay with it being a plagiarized thing because we think it's still massively beneficial for the people involved. Here's what I'm going to do in this speech. First, I'm going to directly challenge the sorts of ideas side proposition has brought forth for it. Then I'm going to give you a more nuanced definition of this creation of art I mentioned and how exactly it imitates and mimics. And then thirdly, I'm going to tell you why that's fairly a good thing, and it has been good for a majority of human history. Let's begin with what they tell me. Essentially, I get two things from them. The first is that art makes you feel something, hence it is revolutionary, and a sub-impact they generate is, it empowers people to fight against oppression. The second thing they tell me is, there can be disagreements within the artistic community. And for some reason, that makes it revolutionary. Let's tackle the first idea that they have for me. I don't think consumption is the point at which you can decide whether or not something is plagiarized. I'll actually give you an example I'm hoping the younger audience is familiar with. Snapchat released this functionality of stories, where you can release 60-second stories. Instagram released the same thing a few months later. The idea is still the same, but I don't think that is what people really cared about. People still consumed this functionality in different ways, that is fine, but the core idea is the same. I think this alludes to something more critical in the way we consume art. While we may consume art, even if something follows the same ideas and principles, our consumption of it can still be a different thing. Our consumption of it can still lead to like different interpretations for us and different impacts on the human psyche. This is, I think, a very important thing that I want you to note, that it is non-exclusive, or it is not an exclusive quality that revolutionary art is the only thing that can make people feel different things. We feel the same forms of art can make people feel different things, and we actually feel this idea of mimicking previous forms of art is the thing that is the refinement necessary for people to consume art in the best possible way. But even if I were to consider the characterization of side proposition tells me that, oh, you know what, everyone perceives art differently. In the same breath, they tell me that revolutionary art makes everyone stand up against oppression. I think everyone standing up against oppression is a very similar form of consumption that they take. I.e., if a certain piece of, if the frame that they want to discuss this debate in is about the consumption or not the creation, then if everyone's consumption leads them to the same outcome, i.e., to stand up against oppression, then I think that also alludes to the fact that the sort of influence art has is very similar across the board. It is not something that is extremely distinct for everyone involved. The second idea they tell me about is disagreement. However, I think a failing on their side of the house is to tell us why this disagreement necessitates revolutionary forms of art. I'm sure even people in the scientific community can disagree about certain sorts of theorems, since that's the example that they wish to throw at us. But I do think all of them do have to fundamentally agree on some baseline axiomatic things upon which they can start having any discussion about artistic things at all. We feel this isn't a very revolutionary concept. This is simply a refinement of it. I think their side necessarily needs to defend a revolutionary progression of art. I think a revolutionary progression cannot simply be, oh, we discuss and disagree about this. This is where I'm going to start talking to you about the positive case we bring from side opposition. And I want you to note, the way we define plagiarism isn't necessarily, oh, person A copied from person B. I think it looks like multiple things. Things like modern artists being inspired by the artists of old. Things like them utilizing techniques of 3D creation or projection or mapping that were developed through the centuries of which art has been progressing. I think in terms of theater, it looks like retelling of old stories or maybe modern day interpretations of older stories. For instance, The Lion King is often seen as a modern reinterpretation of Macbeth, a plagiarized concept, a concept that's already been delivered, but still something that derives value for the people that try to watch it. Even the theorems in science that they talk about, academic work that is usually released in different scientific journals, all of these have to refer to the scientists who made the baseline assumptions for them. They have to cite the people who created, who proved a lemma or a theorem or a corollary through which they then define the theorem that they wish to push forward. I think the art is actually a linear thing that sometimes branches out, but it is always a progressive thing that is based upon the creation of old. It is always based on something that has already been done. It simply refines it to a certain degree. This refinement is not revolutionary. Proposition needs to necessarily defend a world where every time a new piece of art is created or a new scientific theorem is created, it necessarily has to go leaps and bounds over something that was already existing. On this, I'll talk to you about the final point. This isn't a bad thing. I think plagiarism has a negative connotation because it somehow means that people have been stealing from other people's work, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I think mimicry is a form of flattery in artistic endeavors because it means that the person who added to the refinement of the lineation of art made a meaningful contribution to the journey that humanity has in its artistic endeavors. I think that's a very positive thing for the artist itself. So the negative connotation of plagiarism vanishes. But more than that, I think it allows people to continue enjoying the things that they already find value in. I.e., if certain stories or artistic pieces give a lot of value to people, I think plagiarizing that thing, maybe adding a slightly new spin to it, allows people to enjoy the same things in a slightly newer light, but still derive the same level of value, which we think is a great thing. For all these reasons, beg you to oppose.
I do agree. Liberty to interpret does and should extend to all. Let's now give both teams an opportunity to ask a question to each other to make this more engaging. First off, let's give team opposition an opportunity to ask a question to team proposition, in which any speaker from team proposition can respond, and then we'll give an opportunity to team opposition to be asked a question which comes from team proposition. So let's have team opposition ask the question first.
You tell me that disagreements and scientific, I'll use the frame of scientific theorem. You tell me that disagreements are necessary there to create new pieces of art, but those disagreements are still built upon existing ideas. You don't just disagree on new revolutionary ideas, you disagree on existing ideas. Doesn't that mean it's still dependent in a large degree on existing ideas? Hence, it has to copy, mimic, or utilize it. Thank you.
If memory serves me correct, there's a quote by Isaac Newton which said that if I've seen further than others, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. We don't necessarily think that just because some knowledge has been built upon pre-existing knowledge, as all human history has, that is necessarily plagiarism. Our conception of plagiarism is using an idea and not adding your own spin to it, or not adding, what is this slide doing to me? And not adding your own ideas into that. I think the conception of plagiarism is highly obscure in opposition model.
Thank you very much. Let's now give the other team to be asked a question. Does team proposition have a question for team opposition?
Given your parameters for defining what plagiarism is there any human being in history who has never plagiarized?
Oh, sure. I think there is a need to then characterize what revolution is to see what plagiarism isn't. For example, we think having a violent rupture from the knowledge systems of the past would be a revolution. For example, a good example from the subcontinent would be doing away with the ghazal form to discuss philosophy, etc., in free verse poetry, in images that have never existed in the Indo-Vedic knowledge system. We would argue that is a revolution, but not all art is revolution. Most of it is simply plagiarism.
Excellent comments. Let's now give team proposition an opportunity to further their case and elaborate their notion and their understanding of art. I now invite the second speaker from team proposition, Mr. Sharjeel. Here.
Sound check, am I audible? All right, I'll start. Yes, we concede that Daniel Mabou's poetry that he wrote for his high school lover probably was not revolutionary, probably was not very good, and probably was plagiarized by someone or maybe some poet he read online when he was doing whatever. We don't really care. But that was never really our burden, right? At Proposition, we never said that a single piece of art or a single piece of poetry by Daniel in his high school years is going to cause a worldwide revolution. That's not what we said. We said art in its cumulative experiences, art as a cumulative process of humans exposing themselves, their nature, their expression is what causes revolution, or is what causes humanity to evolve as a species. Case in point, how we live very different lives from the people who lived their lives ago 200 years ago, and 200 years before that, and 200 years before that. So yes, of course, revolution can come about every second. We need to settle down in our lives, ladies and gentlemen. But the whole point being that it does come about. Over the course of centuries, over the course of decades, over the course of a single year, people come up with new ideas. Because we argue that human inspiration, that human creativity is not plagiarism. Human ideas are real. Human ideas are not abstract, which is why we're completely fine with having people redo or reshape previous existing ideas. We're completely okay with people taking the old and making it something new. Because we understand that knowledge is built upon more knowledge. We understand that ideas are built upon more ideas. That does not necessarily mean that the artist copied from the previous artist. Yes, he took inspiration. Yes, he got an idea, but that does not mean that that idea is relatively, decremental in value or does not really exist. Because look at the examples they're giving. Snapchat and Instagram app features. Like, ladies and gentlemen, come on. Is that really a definition of art we set up for you guys? Is that really what art looks like? Art looks like a scientist pondering over one single thing for the past 20 years. Art looks like people working tens or decades of their lives fixing just one problem, making just one idea, right? Leonardo da Vinci was able to paint Mona Lisa over the course of a couple of months. But was that art revolutionary? Of course it was, because it introduced new ideas and new ways of painting. But keep in mind that these ideas and ways are always coming about. Ballard said that the only way we can ever have revolutionary ideas is when you have a complete turn of events. But if someone maybe tries to do something more efficiently, maybe comes up with a new idea or new method of doing something, maybe they have a faster way of 3D printing, maybe they invent a pen that can 3D print, maybe they have some new printer that can print different shapes or more complicated shapes. These are also forms of revolution which come about from the idea of human beings thinking about what to do and what not to do, about them thinking that this is good or that this is bad or something that can be done. We don't understand how plagiarism is a simple idea of building upon knowledge. From our conception, and mind you, I think this conception is correct, from our conception of what plagiarism looks like from at least a modern society, is of people literally copying ideas and repasting them without giving any spin. So even in academic research papers, when you quote or reference different articles, you're still supposed to change their wording or change the way they look like because you want to avoid plagiarism. That automatically means we're completely okay with academics, maybe using the ideas of old because you cannot come up with history or 2,000 years of knowledge again and again. We're completely okay with that. What we don't understand is team opposition's conception of how if you do not revolutionize the entire modern conception with just one article, then we don't think it's revolutionary at all. That's not really the case. It's a cumulative human experience that goes off from year to year, generation to generation, that inspires and brings about more youth and more art. What were the things that we said at Proposition that was completely left untouched by Daniel? Right? We told you how art in and of itself makes people feel. It makes people indulge in more. The subjective nature of art in and of itself is very, very important. Case in point, how even if we can see that the ideas of art can be subjective, there's still maybe an underlying premise that the artist wishes to impose. Case in point, how Allama Iqbal's poetry towards revolutionizing the subcontinent, having Muslims take up power and make their own country, was something that even though it's still subjective to this day and still interpreted, the main idea or the main intention behind that is still recognized universally as an idea which was meant to inspire and revolutionize the Muslim community in the subcontinent, which we don't really understand what the main problem is. But number two, we also said that the revolution in nature can also come about from the interpretation in and of itself, right? So we gave you examples of Ai Weiwei, who is a Chinese artist trying to bring about attention towards things like the attention to migrants, right? So we said, apart from just things like, revolutionizing the whole thing, we can also bring about new ideas that change human perception, that change the way we think. That in and of itself is also a revolutionary idea because it brings new things or new perspectives into the community's mind. It changes the way people think, the way the people feel, right? Because you oftentimes cannot interact or interpret something the same way from maybe, a piece of music that you can from maybe a painting or maybe some article that someone wrote. All of these are subjective and different forms of art that ultimately end up benefiting the people, benefiting perspective, and changing the way we think. Feminism in and of itself was an idea that was brought about through new artists, I would say, that came about and brought about new ways of thinking through poetry, through paintings, through media, whatever medium they could find. All of these are art forms that brought about revolution in the perspectives or the mindsets of the people. And that is the most key thing that the artist or the art in and of itself can do. So at the end of the day, yes, we completely concede that Danial Maqbool's poetry will not revolutionize the world, at least we hope it doesn't. But at the same time, we also concede that art in and of itself is cumulative. It is built upon the knowledge of the people, and that is not plagiarism. That is inspiration, that is ideas, that is innovation. Extremely proud to propose.
Before we move on, and I do agree that art inspires and hence is and can be revolutionary, let's give an opportunity to team opposition to ask a question to team proposition.
Your argumentation is that there is once in 200, 300 years a revolutionary form of art. That is truistic. Nobody can argue against the fact that there is a revolutionary art every 500 years. The spirit of the debate then would be to argue that all art, no matter how unique it is, by the virtue of being an expression of the human creativity, is revolutionary. How do you defend?
I think the defense would then assume on the definition of revolution. We don't define revolution as this major, huge turn of events. A revolution would also be someone just changing their mindset, or maybe someone thinking of something in a different light. It doesn't have to be like this, oh, let's pick up arms against, like the Nazis or like some Marxist state. It could be something very small as well. We don't define revolution as this whole tsunami of ideas. I think that is how we would defend that.
All right, excellent engagement. Let's now give an opportunity to team opposition to further defend their case and really hear the thrust of their argument.
Mic check. Am I audible? Okay, excellent. Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Side proposition argues that art is revolutionary every 300 years, and upon being questioned has shifted their premise to, oh, but revolution isn't really standing up against oppression, it's also changing the way you think or the way, for example, you are doing things. We think inherently between their two speeches there has been a disconnect in what revolution truly means or shall be characterized for art. I think the proposition has done a rather weak job at it. But what do we take away from the examples they've given? Because that's the most solid thing that they have focused on. Let's take their best example that they have, Iqbal. Oh, his idea was revolutionary because he had a philosophy. Sure, that idea might be revolutionary in content, but in style, it wasn't really. It were previous Persian poets that really made it possible for Iqbal to even express in the Persian language such nuanced philosophical argumentation. It was poets like Hafiz or Orani, or for example, Sadi, which gave Persian language and metaphor the nuance that it required to express, for example, subjects that Iqbal wanted to talk about. So we think in that inherent thing is the argumentation of the opposition, that it is not possible for you to break away from the systems of the past to express or create art, because art inherently stands on a shared meaning. When you see a particular image in a painting or a poem, you understand that the symbol stands for something. A rose would stand for love, a nightingale for the lover. Very easy, right? We think in these instances where art inherently is a collective shared imagination of the humankind, we can't really argue that it's a revolution that breaks away or radically changes things. Because even if we're changing our perception, the framework within which art exists and is perceived, understand here that we're taking both the argumentation the proposition has. Creation, the artist is creating the art with the same symbols within the same framework, and the consumption of art as well is happening within the same framework. We might interpret what for example, the lover and the loved, Rose and the Nightingale's characters are doing in the painting differently, but we all understand that those two characters exist in the painting. We don't think in that particular instance, the shared subjectivity stands on a premise that is from the past. In that way, we think it is the effort of people who have created this art over those centuries, and that needs to be acknowledged. Their idea of, oh, you simply need to acknowledge that people have done their work, that isn't exactly plagiarism, that's inspiration. Sure, that's a issue of definition, but the idea inherently is that people who have done that work deserve that credit, and what you're doing is simply reworking that, and we think agreeing or accepting the fact that it's plagiarism simply gives that due credit where it's due. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think our first speaker did an excellent job on arguing why plagiarism in art isn't really a bad thing. Because the primal human emotions of, for example, love, betrayal, etc., remain same throughout the centuries. The way they change is their circumstances and the way we retell them. An excellent example of this was, for example, Macbeth being reworked into The Lion King. You can't really tell it's Macbeth when you first watch it, but the emotions or the plot is necessarily the same, which means that art is created or recreated in a way which might reflect our modern condition in different ways, but is premised upon the same primal feelings. I think this entire line of argumentation deals with a lot of what the proposition had to say. A few things that are still standing, for example, is art exposes their premise that art is revolutionary because it is human creativity and it exposes your nature or essence. We think if something is premised upon the essence of things or the inherent nature of things, it can by definition be revolutionary because it isn't either radically changing that because it works within the same framework, argumentation I've already made, or it relies on the essence that we have. So in that case, art is a linear continuation of something that is inherent within us. We think proposition had to do a better job to qualify what revolution really looks like. But even if I am to take their best definition of what revolution is, that is changing the way you think. Even if, for example, we're changing our modern conception of cosmology, or the way, for example, understanding new things about star or the solar system, we think that still is based on a framework provided by classic the classical physics, right? Either the Newton's version or Einstein's. Even in the case, their best case scenario where art is revolutionary because simply it changes the way we think, we still think that change exists within a framework, that's happening within a framework, hence art isn't really revolutionary. Why should you vote for opposition today? You should vote for opposition because A, we think opposition had a clear idea of what the motion argued about. We had a consistent stance, unlike the proposition, which shifted their stance here and there and tweaked it to absorb our criticism of their ideas, right? Secondly, we also think you should vote for opposition because we also had a clear idea of the history of art, the creation of it, the way art exists in certain frameworks, or the, for example, linearity of the history that art exists. For all those reasons, it was clear that opposition did a few things that proposition couldn't in this debate. A, had a consistency in our argumentation, and second, had a historical relevance to the creation and consumption of art. For all those reasons, very proud to oppose.
Mimicry is a form of art that's also flattery. Interesting words. Before we take this debate further, I would like to remind our audience that we put out a poll for you guys because we want to know where you stand. We want to know where our audience stand. And I will quickly share the results for it before we allow both teams an opportunity to share their summaries and what they felt about the debate. 20% of the people who voted for plagiarism as art they believe is plagiarism. 80% of the people that we had voted for revolution, defining art as always revolutionary. Having said that, let's now give an opportunity to Team Proposition first to present their case summary.
Should I start? Clearly, we have the people's choice. Thank you for that, for the poll, and obviously choosing the side that makes logical sense and is giving arguments that make sense, and for believing in art. Because team opposition would have you believe that they understand the conception, linearity, and the history of art, where the examples it gives of Snapchat, Instagram in first opposition, clearly they know what they're talking about. Because it was our side that actually gave examples of people making art within revolutionary periods, people making art to inspire others, people making art to shed light on issues that are affecting humanity. But also look at the burdens team opposition is placing on us. They said it's our job to prove to you how even Danyal Maqbool's poetry is a form of revolutionary art, or maybe in this case, Balaz's poetry, because he's really into art. But at the same time, they'd expect us to say, oh, no, it's fine if one or two pieces of art are revolutionary because that's not really our burden, but everything else is completely plagiarized. What it is saying, ladies and gentlemen, what is really their burden? If our burden was to prove to you that art can be revolutionary, then the few instances within the 200, 300 years should be enough to prove that art, in fact, can be revolutionary. And in all of the cases, even if it's plagiarized, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. But they had to prove to you how even this revolutionary art was plagiarized, and they did this. They said, oh, well, all theorems are based on classical physics, and all, ideas are based on language that was invented by someone else, i.e. Allama Iqbal. That's great, but by that logic, any building of knowledge or anything that a human being does is basically an imitation or copycat of others. Do you really believe that you as an individual are nothing more than the accumulated or the imitated self of those before you? Are you as a Pakistani or you as any citizen within any country nothing more than your parents, nothing more than your grandparents, nothing more than the people you visit, the people you are around? No. You yourself are your own person. You have your own ideas. You have your own inspirations. You have your own emotions. You have your own way of reacting to things, to accepting things, to believing things, to doing things, to I don't know, 100 other examples that I can give you guys. Right? We think that human beings fundamentally are not imitations of people in the past. Yes, we concede, being a reasonable side, mind you, that the past does affect us. The past, our experiences do inspire us, do change us, do motivate us to think. But keep in mind that if Allama Iqbal was never there, then the spins that he brought on Persian language as replaced by Balaj would have never come about. Because if it was not for Allama Iqbal, no one else could have done the same thing Allama Iqbal did, because Allama Iqbal is a special person, just like all of us over here who are individual selves, who have our own ideas, who have our own mindsets. That's number one. Number two, we say that if your argumentation literally is that plagiarism is not a loss in value, in fact, it's a good thing, don't you automatically also concede that plagiarism is in fact not plagiarism as a whole? Because what adds value to something? What makes something special? What makes something better? We think it's the idea of giving it a new spin, adding a perspective that was not previously there. In all of those instances, we don't necessarily think that plagiarism isn't what's occurring as a whole, because in most cases, from what I know at least, plagiarism in modern society is frowned upon. It's bad. It makes things lose value. It makes things lose credibility. It makes things lose originality, which is definitely not the case in Lion King. I love that movie. It's amazing, right? At the same time, we don't necessarily think that plagiarism should in any instance be credited for someone who's just building off or taking inspiration from someone else. We're completely fine with a painter deciding to paint after looking at Leonardo da Vinci's works or Michelangelo's works or Salvador Dali's works. We're completely okay with that. We're completely okay with someone becoming a filmmaker after seeing Christopher Nolan's Batman Rises or The Dark Knight Rises, right? The whole point being that inspiration is something that comes from the mind, and your mind is simply it's not plagiarism. It is your own idea. It is your own self-worth. It is your own imagination, creativity. That is something that can never be copied. It is yours to keep and is yours to own. We are very proud to propose.
We all make mistakes, and I believe I might have made one too. This might be my Steve Harvey moment and my fame to claim, but I believe I missed an opportunity for the proposition to ask a question to the opposition. Let's give them this opportunity now. Does the proposition have a question for team opposition?
Let's say that we buy your premise of art being plagiarized, right? Tell us how that does not make the art lose its value and bring about revolution, even if we buy into your premise that it is plagiarized.
The separation needs to be done in two quarters. A, that is the creation of art, which we say is inherently plagiarized. And then that's the consumption of art. Whatever impact it may have doesn't matter, because even if you, by your argumentation, all art might be conceived differently, but there's an underlying premise or idea that the artist is trying to convey, which we all get. The reason we all get that underlying idea is because that art is using object from our collective imagination, which has been built over these centuries, making it a form of reworking of the past plagiarism.
Refining art over the years, making it better or making it worse? Let's now hear from team opposition to summarize their case that they've presented so far.
Am I audible? I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. If I were to summarize Shurjil's last speech, it would be summarized as thus. Don't worry, we're all special. There are no losers here. But we don't think that's necessarily the case. I'll come to that idea later, but 3 arguments that they present in their reply speech, right? First, not really an argument, but I'd still like to address it. Snapchat and Insta aren't really art. Oh, it's such bad examples. We disagree. We think they are complicated pieces of art in cases of not only algorithms, but their user interfaces as well. We think that argument's bad because it divides art into highbrow and lowbrow. Some art is necessarily better than other. And that's really a classist argument to make, right? We think TikTok is an excellent example of modern contemporary electronic art. People have the ability to create art, make funny things or beautiful things with the digital accessibility that these applications give to these people. So we think that those instances of art, which is this electronic media, for example, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, whatever, is also a part of this debate. It shouldn't be dismissed. That's just bad debating, right? But secondly, if they finally, in their reply speech, have understood our argument, when Shurjil sarcastically says, oh, by your argumentation, all art would be copied. Exactly. All art is copied. There is no originality in thought. We are not individuals. We are simply products of our society. And it's interesting that Shurjil brings up this idea of we are special individuals and persons in his reply speech, because that's really a modern idea. The idea that we're individual and we're different didn't really exist before the 18th century. We can thank Mr. Thomas Hobbes for that weird idea that messed up half of our world. But still, we don't think necessarily that you are a special person who brings a lot of things to this world. We think what happens, or what is a far more realistic premise that you should buy, is that you are a person that comes into this world that takes a lot from your environment and society, which means that a lot of the way that you process things, the way you see things, the way you conceptualize ideas such as identity, time, or, for example, love, whatever, is formed by the way you live in a society. In that particular instance, it is very hard for them to argue that every piece of art that they will create will suddenly revolutionize the way we conceptualize these concepts that we inherently take from the society into which we are born. That is why you would see such different conceptions of what love is in, for example, societies across the world, or what time is. A great example of that is Western linear time. They assume time is linear and it has only one thing. We assume time is parallel, which is why Pakistani people are late to places most of the time, right? That is just one way in which we conceptualize time that is different between cultures, because we assume time is parallel. It is always filled with more than one thing. It is never set aside purely for one thing in itself. We think ideas such as these, the way we understand or characterize the world around us, are what inherently shape art. Given that we take these from our societies, it is hard for the proposition to argue that all of us are these fairies that are born into this world with like happy-go-lucky auras that we exude everywhere we go, and we're very special because we can change the world. We think that's a very naive way to see the world, that we can all suddenly change the world. We don't think that happens. We don't think we're special individuals. A much more sad and somber reality, but a reality that's much more logically built, and you should buy in this debate, right? Lastly, their idea of, oh, if all art is plagiarism, then what is art? Or why should we think that art is anything and it's just weird, right? So the idea is that even though it exists on the, for example, premises that the world has set before, for example, me building on premises Mr. Daniel Maqbool had set, plagiarism, right? It doesn't devalue the argument I'm making, and it's still good enough to take down the proposition's argument, right? Lastly, sometimes words do heavy lifting in Urdu poetry. That's called istilah, using a word beyond what it means. We think that was the same case with the proposition and the word revolution today. Thank you.
I thank both teams for an engaging debate. Now, traditionally, teams would shake hands and congratulate each other of a good debate, but we are not doing that because we're following the SOPs. Sitting quietly so far is our expert on gender, art, and education. We'll give her time to deliberate on her decision and think about what, move to her and hear her share a few words about how she felt the debate went. But before I do that, a quick reminder that we do have a post-debate poll as well. I have to do this before I close the house because we want to know, again, where you now stand. Were the speakers able to convince you? That poll is now online, live at live.sotevents.com. Share your opinion with us because we do want to know where you stand. I myself have had an excellent time today, given in this very artistic space with young people talking about art. I believe I've had quite an amazing time. I hope that there is questions posted and there's thoughts shared in the comments on Facebook, Instagram, and on the page. And we'll get to it in terms of knowing where you guys are coming from, because the purpose of this is to know what people think, what the young minds are thinking about today's world, and how do we intend to move forward. Might I check with the adjudicator if she's ready? There we are. Yes. We will give an opportunity to ask the audience if the teams are okay with it. Let's give an opportunity for the audience to ask a question. We do, in fact, have an audience in the live studio. Is there a question from the audience?
I have a question. I don't know if anyone else.
Now, how do I get my voice to be heard by people who are watching from home? You have a choice of two
I can give
mics.
you a mic.
Yeah.
Okay. My question is more of an observation, and I would like your take on it. What I've read is that Monet was inspired by an artist called Baudin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. And I just feel that in life, as in art, we all learn from imitating before we go on to make revolutionary, hopefully revolutionary changes and expressions. So isn't that okay?
We think as propositions that that's perfectly okay. We think that that idea of inspiration is something that is intrinsic to the human nature as well. That's not something that we're absolutely against. If you copy the idea that, let's say, Monet presented, and then your own artistic twist was there to give that idea the revolutionary nature that it requires, that is something that is important. Iqbal's idea would not have been revolutionary if people thought that his ideas were an imitation of the people that were before him. That is the argumentation proposition stands for.
That was a little piece of how we want the society to engage, how we want them to have conversations and talk about issues that we do not normally engage in. Now, I am told that our adjudicator is ready, and I will pass this floor to her and have her share her light on this.
Thank you so much, Ali, and thank you for a very amusing and engaging reminder of how things used to be. I've been afraid I've been out of touch with debating for a very long time, but I think this was the only debate that I would have been really happy to sit in on. Okay. Forgive me. So I'm just going to start by, it feels like poor Gauguin got left out of the room altogether when he is just such an interesting character, just a very controversial character in his own right, but fundamentally a very interesting character. And if you guys had the opportunity to look him up or read up on him, in the short version is that he was part of the era that was just so terribly exhausted of the skullduggery of the industrial period, which quite frankly was one of the most creative aspects of human history. Perhaps we have never been more creative than we were during the early industrial revolution. But what it did lead to is serious levels of unhappiness. And Gauguin was just part of a movement of artists who needed to return to nature or an aspect of the primitive, which is why he took off to Tahiti. And most of his art are these idyllic, abstract reimaginings of what joy and simplicity of outside of the structured industrial life can be, right? And that is the great power of art, so to say. You mentioned, I was happy at least that you mentioned La Morte de Marat, which is Jacques-Louis David's great work. And you're absolutely right that it did play a big part in the French Revolution. And I was surprised that no one mentioned, Frida Kahlo's and her husband's work during the Spanish Revolution, like if that is the route that you were going to go. Although I'm happy that at least by the time we got down to the second speakers, we had some degree of clarity on what you guys wanted to debate. So I think perhaps for a 6-minute speech, proposition may have taken on too much of a challenge in debating both the conception as well as the reception of art. And I felt that perhaps there was at times in this debate also a disconnect between, whether you wanted to debate the effects of art upon a society, which is to inspire revolution or inspire change, or whether it is that you wanted to debate the very nature of art, of whether it is fundamentally creative or always just like the latest expression of a collective human imagination which is in the process of evolution. Now, if I go on any further right now, I'll be giving in the judgment a little too soon, so I'm going to hold out. I'm just going to add a few general comments before I get down to the final part of what I've based today's decision on. And one, I believe in some respect, considering that debaters are frequently the greatest minds that we generally have in a classroom. As a teacher, I felt that perhaps this debate was also a case for greater investment from all sides in an artistic education, because one of the things that I learned after I stopped debating is the great art and magic of silence and listening and speaking slower so that other people can understand what you're saying. And but also, I am glad that at some point this debate did trigger, or that both sides to some degree did realize how essential art is to the human process. We can try and reduce our human experience repeatedly down to mechanical or systematic or structural changes, such as revolutions in means of productions, or in political governance, or in the systems and organizations of our societies. But behind all of that is the great collective creative imagination of human beings, which evolves over time, and art which provokes, or art which questions. Because I would have to agree with the proposition there that very much so art makes us feel. Art is the great human expression of everything that you cannot put in a box. And I believe Gauguin is the greatest example, one of the greatest examples in that. Not alone, there's Thomas Cole, the great landscape painter of the Americas. There's so many others, Turner, these inspirational people who have to take us out of this mechanical imagination to get us to really feel, to really be human. And art fundamentally is to be human, and which is why it means so much to us and provokes such deep thinking and such deep change over time. Now, from what I gathered by the end of this, what sense I could make by the end of it was that a proposition was attempted to make a case for how, since every artist's perspective is unique, even when there is a reinterpretation of what has come before, it is always fresh and it is always new. Whereas the opposition tried to build a very good argument, I must say, in favor of, and I feel that it was slightly unfair as well, because it was bordering on being very totalistic in terms of its thinking, that anything that comes from the collective human imagination, and therefore nothing is new. And that argument in itself is interestingly nothing new at all, because it's been reiterated by writers and artists and everyone over time. However, I still felt that the opposition was not able, the opposition's argument was not able to preclude that every new artistic imagination is not new. And on that basis alone, I'd have to grant this match to the proposition. Congratulations and commiserations. Thank you for a very good debate. And thank you for the School of Tomorrow for having us here.
You're most welcome. On behalf of the administration, I thank both the teams here. Let's now move to the poll by the live audience and see where they stand. As far as I know, the poll should be live on the screen now. From the poll we had earlier, from 20%, people now believe up to 26.67% that art, in fact, is plagiarism. However, 73.33% people still believe that art can always result in revolution. I thank the Ambience Boutique Art Hotel, live with the SOT events. This is me, Ali Chattha, signing off. I thank all the teams that have participated with us today. I thank Beaconhouse Defense Campus for sending in this lovely young man, for timekeeping for us today. And I also thank our adjudicator for her excellent words. Thank you very much for joining us. See you again very soon. Allah Hafiz.